3 weeks later, Karen stood in her driveway, watching the moving truck back up to the Henderson house. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her campaign to drive them out of the neighborhood had ultimately succeeded, just not in the way she'd intended. The criminal charges had been reduced to misdemeanors in exchange for restitution and community service. Karen now spent her Saturday mornings picking up litter in the park, wearing an orange vest that was far less flattering than her old HOA president badge. The pool repair had cost her $12,000, the legal fees another $8,000, and her reputation was worth approximately nothing. Mike Henderson emerged from his house carrying a box of kitchen supplies. He spotted Karen and walked over, his expression unreadable. "Thought you'd want to know. We're moving to a neighborhood without an HOA, he said, not unkindly. "I heard," Karen replied. "I'm sorry, Mike. About everything." "Are you?" Mike studied her face, searching for sincerity. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you got exactly what you wanted." Karen considered this. The Henderson house would be empty within days. Its new owners would undoubtedly be more compliant with regulations, and Willowbrook Estates would return to its previous state of manicured perfection. "I wanted you to follow the rules," she said finally. "I didn't want to terrorize your children." "But you did terrorize them. Lisa still has nightmares about bricks falling from the sky." Mike's voice carried a weight that made Karen's chest tighten. "Tommy asks why the mean lady wanted to hurt our pool. I never meant." "You meant exactly what happened, Karen. You just didn't think about the consequences." After Mike walked away, Karen stood alone in her driveway, surrounded by the perfect lawns and regulation-compliant mailboxes she'd spent 3 years cultivating. The HOA board had voted her out of office in an emergency session, the first time in the organization's history that a president had been removed for cause. Her replacement was Mrs. Johnson, the elderly woman who had supported Karen for years before watching her throw bricks into a swimming pool. The transition had been remarkably smooth. Apparently, the neighborhood had been functioning just fine without Karen's micromanagement. David had moved into the guest bedroom, their conversations now limited to logistics and legal updates. Her grown children called less frequently, their embarrassment palpable even over the phone. Karen had become the cautionary tale parents told their children about the dangers of unchecked authority. But as she watched the moving truck pull away, Karen felt something she hadn't experienced in years: curiosity about what came next. For the first time since becoming HOA president, she had no meetings to attend, no violations to document, no authority to exercise. Her calendar was empty, her purpose undefined. The new owners of the Henderson house would arrive next month. Karen had already prepared a welcome packet with all the relevant HOA guidelines, community standards, and contact information. Old habits died hard. But she'd also included something new: a handwritten note apologizing in advance for any mistakes she might make as a neighbor. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a start. That evening, Karen sat in her backyard, looking out over the fence where the Henderson pool used to gleam in the fading light. The new owners had it filled in, replacing it with a garden that would undoubtedly exceed all HOA landscaping requirements. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts, stopping at a number she hadn't called in months. Her finger hovered over the dial button, uncertainty warring with need. "Hello, Mom," she said when the familiar voice answered. "It's Karen. I was wondering, would you like to come visit? I have some things I need to talk about." The conversation that followed was halting at first, then increasingly honest. Karen found herself telling her mother about the pool, the bricks, the fear in the children's eyes. She talked about the loneliness of authority, the way rules had become a substitute for relationships, the moment when enforcement became revenge. By the time she hung up, the sun had set, and the neighborhood had settled into its evening quiet. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the faint sound of children playing, their laughter carrying on the summer breeze. Karen listened to the sound for a long time, wondering if she'd ever learn to hear it as joy instead of violation. The question would have to wait for tomorrow, along with all the other questions she was finally ready to ask. But one thing was certain: Willowbrook Estates would never be quite the same, and neither would she. Karen Whitmore stood at her kitchen window, coffee mug trembling in her manicured grip as she watched the Henderson children cannonball into their backyard pool. The audacity, the absolute, unbridled audacity. "Third time this week," she muttered, yanking her HOA president badge from the drawer and pinning it to her floral blouse like armor. The badge caught the morning light, gleaming with the authority of someone who had never met a rule she wouldn't enforce. She marched across her perfectly manicured lawn, her sensible shoes clicking against the decorative stones that separated her property from the Hendersons. The pool area was chaos, towels strewn about, pool noodles floating like rebellious serpents, and worst of all, music playing above the community-mandated 60-decibel limit. "Excuse me." Karen's voice cut through the laughter like a rusty blade. "Mike Henderson, we need to talk." Mike emerged from his garage, tool belt hanging loose around his waist, grease stains on his shirt. Everything about him screamed nonconformist to Karen's trained eye. "Morning, Karen. What's the emergency today?" "Your pool activities are in direct violation of HOA Code 7.32, excessive noise during morning hours, and 12.05, failure to maintain visual barriers during recreational activities." She consulted her laminated rulebook, fingers dancing across the pages with practiced precision. Mike's laugh was warm but tired. "Karen, it's my pool, my kids, my backyard. Your backyard is part of Willowbrook Estates, which means it falls under my jurisdiction." Karen's chest puffed with righteous indignation. "I'm giving you 48 hours to install proper screening and implement quiet hours, or I'll be forced to take action." "What kind of action?" Mike's voice carried a warning edge that Karen completely missed. "The kind that ensures compliance." Karen spun on her heel, her bob haircut swishing with finality. 48 hours, Mr. Henderson." As she stalked back to her house, Karen felt the familiar rush of authority coursing through her veins. She'd been HOA president for 3 years, and in that time, she'd transformed Willowbrook Estates from a chaotic free-for-all into a model of suburban perfection. Every lawn was precisely maintained, every mailbox regulation compliant, every fence the approved shade of beige. But the Hendersons had always been her white whale. They'd moved in 6 months ago, and despite her best efforts, they continued to live as if rules were merely suggestions. Their grass was a 1/4 inch too long, their garden gnomes were non-approved decorative items, and now this flagrant disregard for community standards. Karen opened her laptop and began typing her incident report, her fingers flying across the keys with the fervor of a woman possessed. She documented every violation, every timestamp, every decibel reading from her sound meter app. The Hendersons would learn that in Willowbrook Estates, Karen Whitmore's word was law. Outside, the sound of children's laughter continued to drift through her windows, each giggle a personal affront to her authority. She cranked up her white noise machine and smiled grimly. 2 days. They had 2 days to comply, or they'd discover exactly what kind of action an HOA president could take. The police arrived to find Karen sitting calmly on her patio, sipping iced tea as if nothing had happened. The lead officer, a tired-looking man in his 50s, introduced himself as Sergeant Martinez and asked her to explain the situation. "I was enforcing HOA regulations," Karen replied, her voice steady despite the chaos unfolding next door. Mr. Henderson repeatedly ignored official notices regarding noise violations and improper pool maintenance. "I took corrective action." "Ma'am, you threw bricks into their swimming pool." "I implemented a water displacement solution to address the safety hazard created by excessive water levels." Karen had spent the last 20 minutes perfecting this explanation, and she delivered it with the confidence of someone who believed her own spin. Sergeant Martinez looked over at the Henderson property, where Mike was attempting to fish bricks out of the pool with a long-handled net while Sarah consoled their crying children. "Mrs. Whitmore, can you show me the HOA regulations that authorize you to throw bricks into residents' pools?" Karen opened her laminated rulebook, fingers dancing across the pages with increasing desperation. The regulations were suddenly less clear than they'd seemed in her kitchen. Section 15.23 grants the HOA president broad authority to address safety violations through necessary interventions. That section says you can send written notices and impose fines. It doesn't say anything about bricks. For the first time since the incident began, Karen felt a flicker of doubt. "Officer, I've been HOA president for 3 years. I know my authority." "Your authority doesn't extend to property destruction, ma'am." The crowd on the street had grown. Karen recognized faces from the neighborhood, the Johnsons, the Pattles, the retired couple from the corner house. They were all staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to disgust to something that looked disturbingly like pity. Mrs. Johnson, an elderly woman who had always been one of Karen's most reliable supporters, shook her head slowly. "Karen, honey, what have you done?" The question hit harder than the police officer's legal citations. Karen had spent 3 years building her reputation as the neighborhood's guardian, the woman who kept property values high and standards higher. Now she was sitting in handcuffs while her neighbors watched her carefully constructed world crumble. "I was protecting the community," Karen said, her voice smaller now. "The Hendersons were violating established guidelines. If I didn't act, others would follow their example." By throwing bricks in their pool, Sarah Henderson had appeared at the fence, her face flushed with anger. "Karen, you could have killed my children." "I was careful to ensure no one was in the immediate splash zone," Karen protested, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. The charges were impressive in their scope: criminal mischief, trespassing, reckless endangerment, and something called malicious destruction of property. Karen listened to each one with growing bewilderment. These were the kinds of charges leveled against criminals, not responsible HOA presidents. As they led her to the police car, Karen caught sight of her reflection in the Henderson's sliding glass door. The woman staring back at her was disheveled, her professional blazer wrinkled, her carefully styled hair askew. She looked like exactly what she was: someone who had lost control so completely that she'd resorted to throwing bricks into a swimming pool. The drive to the station passed in a blur of familiar streets and unfamiliar shame. Karen had lived in Willowbrook Estates for 15 years, had been HOA president for 3 of those years, and had never once imagined she'd see the neighborhood from the back of a police car. Her husband David arrived at the station 2 hours later, his face a mask of quiet disappointment. "Karen, what were you thinking?" "I was thinking about property values," Karen replied, but the words felt like ashes in her mouth. "I was thinking about community standards." "You threw bricks into their pool, Karen." Their children were terrified. The booking process was efficient and humiliating. Fingerprints, photographs, personal effects sealed in plastic bags. Karen Whitmore, HOA president, became Karen Whitmore, booking number 2025 to 7847. But even as she sat in the holding cell, waiting for her lawyer to arrive, Karen felt something unexpected: relief. For the first time in 3 years, she wasn't responsible for monitoring anyone's grass height or mailbox compliance. She was just a woman who had made a spectacularly bad decision, and somehow, that felt like freedom. 49 hours later, Karen stood in her kitchen, watching the Henderson children splash in their pool with the same reckless abandon as before. Not a single screen had been installed, not one quiet hour observed. The insurrection was complete. "Fine," she whispered, her reflection in the window showing a woman transformed. Gone was the pleasant suburban mother of 2 grown children. In her place stood a general preparing for war. Karen's first call was to the City Code Enforcement Office. "Yes, this is Karen Whitmore, HOA president of Willowbrook Estates. I need to report multiple violations at 1247 Maple Drive." She rattled off a list of infractions, some real, some creatively interpreted, all delivered with the confidence of someone who had memorized every municipal code in the county. Her second call was to the landscaping company that maintained the common areas. "I need you to deliver a truckload of decorative bricks to my address." "Yes, today. It's for a community beautification project." Mike Henderson was in his driveway, loading his truck for work, when Karen appeared at his mailbox with a clipboard and a grim expression. "Mr. Henderson, as you failed to comply with my previous notice, I'm issuing formal citations for noise violations, failure to maintain property screens, and," she paused. Consulting her notes, Improper pool maintenance. Improper pool maintenance. Mike's voice was dangerously quiet. The water level appears to be 3 inches above regulation height, creating potential flooding hazards for neighboring properties. Karen's voice carried the satisfaction of someone who had found a technicality and intended to ride it to victory. Mike stepped closer, his 6-foot frame casting a shadow over Karen's 5'4" stature. "Karen, I'm going to say this once, and I want you to listen carefully. That's my pool, my family, my property. If you don't back off, we're going to have a problem." Karen's spine straightened. In 30 years of suburban living, no one had ever spoken to her with such naked defiance. The thrill was intoxicating. "Mr. Henderson, threats against HOA officials are grounds for immediate escalation to our legal department." "It's not a threat, Karen. It's a promise." As Mike drove away, Karen felt something she hadn't experienced in years: genuine excitement. The Henderson situation had evolved beyond a simple compliance issue. It was now a test of her authority, her competence, her very identity as the guardian of Willowbrook Estate standards. The bricks arrived that afternoon. Karen signed for them with trembling hands, her mind racing with possibilities. She'd read about HOA presidents in other communities who had taken decisive action against non-compliant residents. Some had blocked driveways, others had filed liens. Karen had a different idea, something more personal, more memorable. That evening, she sat in her car at the end of the street, watching the Henderson house. The family was having a barbecue, the sound of laughter and conversation drifting across the manicured lawns. Other neighbors had joined them: the Johnsons, the Pattles, the new couple from the corner house. They were all there, enjoying themselves on the Henderson property, tacitly endorsing their rule-breaking behavior. Karen's grip tightened on the steering wheel. The disease was spreading. Soon, every resident would think they could ignore HOA guidelines, and everything she built would crumble. She thought about her empty house, her absent children who visited twice a year, her husband who worked late to avoid her evening recitations of neighborhood infractions. The Hendersons had what she'd lost: community joy, the kind of effortless happiness that came from living without constant vigilance. And that, Karen realized, was the most unforgivable violation of all. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of Saturday that made normal people want to open their windows and enjoy the fresh air. Karen had been awake since 4 a.m., pacing her kitchen, rehearsing her plan. The decorative bricks sat in her garage like ammunition, waiting for deployment. She'd spent the night researching legal precedents, HOA enforcement mechanisms, and property rights. The beauty of her position was that she could act with impunity. The HOA board consisted of herself and 2 other members who rarely attended meetings and generally rubber-stamped her decisions. She was accountable to no one but herself. At 8 a.m. sharp, Karen knocked on the Henderson door. Mike answered, still in his pajamas, coffee mug in hand. Behind him, she could see his wife Sarah making pancakes while their 2 kids, Tommy and Lisa, sat at the kitchen table in their swimsuits. "Karen," Mike said, his voice flat with resignation. "What now?" "Final notice," Karen announced, producing an official-looking document from her folder. "You have until noon today to comply with all outstanding violations, or I'll be forced to take direct action to protect the community's interests." Sarah appeared at Mike's shoulder, her blonde hair pulled back in a messy bun, flour dusting her apron. "What's this about, Karen?" "Your husband knows exactly what this is about." Karen's eyes remained fixed on Mike. 12 hours. That's more than generous. Or what? Sarah's voice carried a sharpness that made Karen's pulse quicken. "Or I'll be forced to take measures to ensure community compliance." Karen turned and walked away, her heart hammering with anticipation. The morning passed in a blur of preparation. Karen changed into her most professional outfit, a navy blazer and matching slacks that made her feel like a corporate executive. She practiced her speech in the mirror, perfecting the tone of righteous authority that had served her so well in HOA meetings. At 11:47 a.m., she loaded the first wheelbarrow with decorative bricks. The Hendersons were in their backyard, the kids already in the pool, their laughter echoing across the neighborhood. Perfect. Karen wheeled the bricks to the gate separating their properties, her breath coming in short gasps. The fence was only 4 feet tall, an easy climb for someone motivated by righteous indignation. She'd been doing yoga for 15 years and prided herself on her flexibility. The first brick hit the pool with a satisfying splash. The children's laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by confused silence. Karen hoisted the second brick, then the third, each one creating a bigger splash, displacing more water. "What the hell are you doing?" Mike's voice roared from the patio door. Karen didn't pause. Fourth brick, fifth brick, sixth. The pool water was turning murky, the children scrambling out in confusion and fear. Ensuring compliance with community standards, she called back, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Mike vaulted over the fence with surprising agility, landing hard on his lawn. "Karen, stop. You're going to hurt someone. I'm protecting the community from your flagrant disregard for established guidelines." Seventh brick, eighth brick. Karen felt more alive than she had in months. Sarah appeared with her phone, recording everything. "I'm calling the police." "By all means," Karen replied, hefting another brick. "They'll be very interested in your violations of municipal noise ordinances and proper pool maintenance protocols." Mike grabbed her arm as she reached for another brick. "Karen, this is insane. You're dumping bricks in our pool. I'm implementing corrective measures." Karen jerked her arm free, surprised by her own strength. When you refuse to comply with reasonable requests, more direct action becomes necessary. The sound of sirens in the distance should have been warning enough, but Karen was beyond reason now. She'd crossed a line, and there was no going back. The 20th brick splashed into the pool with finality, and Karen stepped back to survey her work. The once pristine swimming pool was now a chaos of displaced water and scattered bricks. The deck was soaked, the children were crying, and half the neighborhood had gathered on the street to watch the spectacle. For the first time in 3 years, Karen Whitmore had everyone's undivided attention.